Perfect. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Okay, so my name is Brianna Jarnigan. I work in ALA's Office for Diversity, Literacy, and Outreach Services, and we are hosting today's webinar presented by Dr. Michelle Villagran. Um, Before we get into the webinar, I just want to briefly go over some tech. Feel free to chat in the box directly to me as a host if there's any tech issues, if you can't hear, if something's going wrong, feel free to chat at me directly. We will go over the webinar, and then the last 5 to 10 minutes will be for questions, which you'll be able to put in the chat box directly for everyone to see, and we'll moderate those at the end. And yeah, without that, we're going to go ahead and get started. Also, this webinar is being recorded, so everyone who is registered will receive an email with the recording, and it will also be posted on ALA site, so those who were not able to be here can view it at a later time as well. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started, and I'd like to introduce our speaker for the session. So Dr. Michelle Villagran is President and CEO of Cultural Co., LLC, specializing in areas of cultural competency, diversity and inclusion, change management, conflict resolution, and emotional intelligence. Additionally, Dr. Villagran is a lecturer with the University of North Texas and LIS coordinator for the University of North Texas Master of Library and Information Science programs. She is a certified advanced cultural intelligence and unconscious bias facilitator through the Cultural Intelligence Center and conflicts dynamic profile consultant. Dr. Villagran earned her MLS degree in legal informatics from the University of North Texas and her MBA in strategic management from the University of North Texas. At Pepperdine University, she completed a certificate in dispute resolution, her master's of dispute resolution, and her doctorate of education in organizational leadership. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Villagran.
Thank you so much, Brianna, and especially thank you to ALA and the ODLOS office for hosting this session. I know it's been in the works, so I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak with all of you. So without further ado, I'm going to go straight to the agenda because we have a lot to cover in a short period of time. So first of all, my agenda, very aggressive. We will get to it all. First, we're going to look specifically at why cultural intelligence is needed, and then identify some cultural challenges. You actually will choose a cultural challenge you're currently facing or have recently faced in your organization, and use that throughout the presentation as an example, and hopefully some of the tips and ideas we receive from the presentation will be able to help solve, or at least resolve, or if you tend to have that situation occur in the future, help solve that particular situation if it were to occur again. Then we're going to talk about cultural value orientations. I'm going to briefly go over 7 dimensions. There are many more, but 7 which do impact our mapping when it comes to cultural differences, as well as dive into the cultural intelligence model that I use through the Cultural Intelligence Center. There are 4 components or 4 capabilities we will cover, and at the same time we will discuss how you can apply them and how you can improve upon your own cultural intelligence as it relates to library and information science. And the next steps, which is critical. So what can you do next? Let me give you a little history first about cultural intelligence. It is a form of intelligence. The emphasis is on nurture more than nature, and it does integrate psychological as well as sociological issues. It draws upon the ability to reformulate one's concept of self and others, and again, it can be integrated with other forms of intelligence. We all have an IQ. We all have a social quotient or an SQ. We all have an emotional intelligence level. Well, you also have a cultural intelligence level. There's generational intelligence, so there are many intelligences out there of which this model can be incorporated. Now, the thing I like about this model, because there are many cultural models out there, is that it applies to any cultural context. And you'll see what I mean when I show you the model. So whether it's diversity initiatives you're having at your organization, Or maybe you're an organization that actually has international locations. So there's some international management that you can apply this model to. Organizational cultures. You have your parent or your headquartered organization. Say you're in a university, so you have your parent organization. But then you have the library. The library has its own subculture. And within the library, each department or each division has its own subculture. So there's many levels of culture within just one entity. And we can also think about generational cultures, gender, professional subcultures. So there are many cultures this can apply to. And it does consist of the 4 components or 4 capabilities I'll show you in the next slide, or a few slides. It is malleable. So right now you do have a cultural intelligence level, and anyone can improve upon that level. So if you were to take an assessment today and maybe you're weak in one of the areas, that's perfectly fine. There's nothing wrong with that. There are things we can each do to improve upon that particular capability. And it is evidence-based. So if you go look in the literature, do some hunting, do lit review, the actual cultural intelligence definition, it came out, was defined in 2003. There's a cultural intelligence scale, which actually measures an individual's competency in each of the 4 cultural intelligence areas. And it's been validated in the United States and in Singapore. And a lot of the research has been across faith-based organizations, corporations, academia, and even government entities. So across the board. So you might say, okay, this makes sense. We know about culture. We know there are cultural issues we encounter probably daily in our lives. I'm sure if I asked how many of you have encountered mutual distrust, everybody's hand will go up. At some point in your career, you've probably encountered mutual distrust. Maybe the headquarter location doesn't trust your branch or your regional location. Maybe you're working with individuals on a team from a different background, maybe a different country, and they don't feel they can trust the team in another country to maybe deliver on time. Maybe there's communication issues as far as timelines and deadlines. So these are just examples where mutual distrust can occur. How about confronting conflict? There are times when a conflict may bubble up and individuals approach conflict differently. Some may be very direct. Others may take an indirect approach. Some might save face. Some may use shame or honor. Maybe it's swept under the rug until it explodes. When you are faced with a challenge that's very difficult or might possibly turn into a conflict, think about, is there a cultural aspect to this? Is there a cultural element that is underlying the particular situation and what's causing this possible conflict? I guarantee you 99.9% of the time, conflicts occur due to a cultural aspect. And then contracts. Contracts may actually mean nothing in some cultures. For example, if you have a written contract, we will say, we'll use a cell phone. You have your cell phone contract. How many of us actually read the fine print? When I ask this, very few say they actually read the fine print. We should read all of those contracts, our credit cards, our contracts with our vendors and publishers. Some particular vendors or publishers may stick directly to what is in that contract in print, where others may say, you know what, that was agreed at that point in time, but this is a different time, different situation. There's some flexibility with that written contract. So it's important for you to do research and even understand, if you negotiate contracts, where is that publisher located? Where's their parent organization located? Who's coming to the table to meet with you? Is it just the direct salesperson you've been working with, or is it their whole team, the president included? How do you even set up the room? All of these are cultural elements which can impact your negotiation of that particular contract. And then, of course, there are language and communication barriers. Now, I heard the other day, I thought it was lower, but I heard a number of 520 languages across the world, worldwide. So clearly just alone with that number, we can see the extent where there might be some barriers that could occur. And it's under times of pressure, stress, when we most need cultural intelligence in order to survive that cultural situation or to help you get through that particular situation. So let me give you the official definition. And here's the source for you. There is actually a full bibliography in the Google Drive. A link was provided in the notes, as well as will be sent out, I believe, with the recording after. So I have a full bibliography of resources that discuss cultural intelligence specifically and other elements of diversity within library and information science. And this is one particular resource that is specific to cultural intelligence, discussing the theory, the measurement, and the application. And the official definition is, and I'm going to read it because I'm going to point out a few key things here, the capability to function effectively across various cultural contexts. So in reading it, I want to point out again that it applies beyond ethnic, beyond racial. I think with our current culture in, we'll say, the United States and the economy, we're seeing a lot with gender, with ethnicity, with race. But remember that there are many, many, many cultures and beyond that. So cultural intelligence predicts one's effectiveness working across many cultural contexts. So again, could be an organizational context, could be generational, etc. It was developed, I'll give you a little background here, as a concept to provide an overarching theoretical framework tying together numerous models into a valid way to measure the capability of cultural competence. So it is multidimensional, and it is based on the application of Robert Sternberg's integrative theoretical framework. And he looked at different loci of intelligence. So the dimensions represent qualitatively different aspects of the overall capability to function and manage effectively in culturally diverse situations. So in our own cultures, if you think of your own culture yourself, where everyone's unique, there are no two individuals, even if you grew up on the same street, maybe even in the same house, we each are very unique. We have an idea of what's going on maybe around us because of our own background, research we've done, wealth of information we've collected, most of which is subconscious. That helps us make sense of what we experience and what we're observing. However, it's when we interact with individuals who come from a different cultural background, which is everyone, because everyone is different, that the same cues may mean something entirely different. And this is why we should be applying our cultural intelligence. So let me talk about cultural differences for a moment, and specifically value orientations. Now this is a list of 7. I'm going to run through each of these to give you some context for each of them. So the first one relates to your personal identity as defined in terms of individual or group characteristics. And there's an assessment I'll show you at the end where you can take related to your cultural value profiles. And it identifies your individual orientation now across 10 cultural value dimensions. And it's important to understand these as a first step to developing your cultural intelligence. We each have a preference, I would say, to whether we're, for example, individualist or collectivist. Individualist is motivated by personal goals, personal incentives, and is more comfortable with autonomy versus working in a team. And then the collectivist is motivated by group goals or long-term relationship. For example, the United States is often described as one of the most individualistic cultures, and China is an example of a collectivist culture. Now remember, we can't make generalizations across the board because there's always an exception to every rule. So we cannot assume that all Americans, all those in the United States, are individualists. So keep that in mind when you're evaluating your own cultural values. Power distance relates to power and status. So if you have low power distance, you forego titles, formalities. You may challenge authority, but high power distance like to follow chain of command and are less likely to question authority. So you can see here the immediate implication for an organization as well, especially if you're in an organization that's very hierarchical. Uncertainty avoidance relates to risk. So do you act first and then get information, or are you comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty? High uncertainty avoidance individuals like explicit instructions, formal procedures, formal policies, and are uncomfortable with ambiguity. So if you think of a team in a library, maybe a particular department, let's say a technical services department, you're working on a project together in a team environment. If you have individuals that are maybe someone's high uncertainty avoidance, someone's low, you can immediately see where there might be some conflict that could develop. One individual wants explicit instructions, bullet point, 1, 2, 3, 4, spelled out. The other, hand it to them, they'll run with it, and they'll get it done regardless of what the instructions are or if there's some formal policy. So right there can be some influence as far as with the team dynamics and in the group environment. Cooperative, competitive, pretty obvious. Cooperative relates to accomplishing results by getting people to work together, so cooperating. And then competitive people will be more motivated to accomplish results when there's some type of competition, so an incentive, or what's in it for me. Time orientation relates to time. So is it short term or long term? And we see this in several cultures. Short term want immediate outcomes, immediate wins. Long term, it's about the relationship, the long term benefit. So you may come into interaction with one another, and if you're working with someone that is from a long term orientation environment, might be like, how's the family? Talk about the weather. What did you do last weekend? Instead of going straight to business. So it's more about developing that relationship, maintaining that relationship. The work will still get done, but it's long-term orientation. They do not sacrifice short-term outcomes for long-term benefits. Context is communication. Are you a direct communicator or an indirect communicator? If you have low context orientation, you value direct communication, and you actually believe people should say what they mean and mean what they say. Now, high context individuals actually pay attention to what's not being said. So where people are seated at the table, how individuals are dressed. They read between the lines. They pay attention to nonverbals. So this is actually one of the cultural differences that creates some of the largest points of conflict for many teams. And it's one that ties directly into the communication piece, even language barriers. And then being and doing, this is one I always like to talk about because it relates to deriving meaning from activity and being productive. For the most part, we're all productive, but it's to the extent, do we work to live or do we live to work? And we can see in some cultures, they might be the work to live mindset. For example, in being-oriented cultures, such as in Western places, like the Nordic countries, people are given ample leave time and prioritizing recreation are actually high priorities to them. In contrast, places like the United States, Japan, Germany were high doing-oriented cultures where productivity and results are rewarded most. So this is critical if you think about patrons that come into your library, staff you have within your library, and if you're supposed to be accomplishing and servicing them and working in teams, well, if someone is high on being productive and it's about results and being rewarded, where someone is the opposite, clearly you can see a conflict may ensue. So we have to be cognizant, if we can, do some research and learn about the cultural values of our staff that we interact with daily, our leadership, and even patron groups that you might regularly work with. If you work with students, if you know there's a huge population coming into your public library, if you can learn about that cultural group more, it'll really help you in your programming, in your advertising, your marketing, even in just your verbal communication with those particular groups. So there's more detail on the cultural value orientations, but I'm happy to address those at the end or later on. You can email me. Now I want to talk about the standards because I think standards are really critical for setting foundation and for knowing that all of these standards listed on this list include diversity elements. I'm going to talk about two specifically. The 2017 update of the American Library Association, their strategic directions, specifically has embedded within them a key action area of diversity. So libraries play a crucial role in empowering diverse populations. Programs of recruitment, training, development, advancement, and promotion are needed in order to increase and retain diverse library personnel. Also, within the association and in the services and operations of libraries, efforts to include diversity in programs, activities, services, professional literature, products, continuing education must be ongoing and encouraged. And there's also discussion about equitable access to information and library services. So everything from language and literacy related barriers, cultural and social isolation, physical and attitudinal barriers, racism, discrimination, all of these are incorporated within the key actions area. Further within the ALA strategic plan are strategic directions. And within the strategic directions, there's a section strictly focused on diversity. I think it's on the last page, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion, EDI. And they provide goals and strategies within this document that I think all of us should take a look at. And even if you're not, say, in a public library setting, or maybe you're an academic, or you're in a special library, or school library, all of these standards we should take a look at to see, well, are we doing what we should be doing within our profession? Our associations are recognizing it, giving us these competencies. Even when we're hiring, are we considering some of these strategic initiatives or key action areas we should be when we're even hiring particular individuals? The other one I will point out, because it is new and revised, it was launched in November 2017, the AASL, the American Association of School Librarians, updated standards, the National School Library Standards for Learners, School Librarians, and School Libraries. They have a real nice framework which includes six shared foundations, and cultural intelligence is most applicable and integrated within their Include foundation. And Include states, learners demonstrating empathy and equity as they embrace diversity and make informed decisions. And there's more detail about that framework and what the domains are, but there's an article I have coming out in Knowledge Quest, which is their journal publication. It'll be coming out, I believe, in May, June. So you can read about how cultural intelligence fits nicely into their newly revised or an updated standards framework, specifically with the Include foundation, one of their 6 shared foundations. And there are other standards as well. So here are 3 other links for you related to standards that we should take a look at. We have the ACRL, which is the Association of College and Research Libraries Diversity Standards. We have the ALCS-SC, Association for Library Services to Children, and then the Young Adult Library Services Association. So each of these do include diversity, cultural competence aspects. So take a look at these standards when you have a moment. Now I'm going to pause for a minute for you to think about my question here or my statement. I want you to take a moment and I want you to think of one cultural challenge in your workplace. And I want you to keep this in your mind, or you can write it down as we explore the cultural intelligence model. One caveat is do not target a person, rather think of a cultural group that presents challenges. So it could be a generational group, a national group, ethnic group, whatever cultural group, but don't target a person in your mind, in your example. Just give you one moment. We will not share these at the end. This is really self-exploration for you to see what you can pull from this model and apply in order to help you with that cultural challenge, current challenge, or maybe a recent challenge you've had. Okay, keep that in mind because here's the model. Just remember these 4 components, 4 capabilities within the cultural intelligence model. So the research actually reveals that the culturally intelligent, again, individuals who effectively accomplish their objectives regardless of the cultural context, have strength in these 4 key areas. So this is the model of the Cultural Intelligence Center. The 4 areas are drive, knowledge, strategy, and action. Or you can think of them as 4 steps. You start with the cultural intelligence, CQ, drive. So CQ is actually cultural quotient. We all have a cultural quotient, cultural intelligence quotient, or level. And the cultural intelligence scale provides that valid and reliable measure of the individual's ability to function effectively in culturally diverse situations. I will tell you the research has been peer-reviewed and published in over 68 academic journals across a wide variety of disciplines. And the actual scale was developed to test and validate Earley and Ang's conceptualization of cultural intelligence, which again is based on Sternberg's research. All of these resources are available in the bibliography if you want to learn more and read the literature. So let me run through the model. The first one is drive. Drive is motivation. Drive is your interest, your confidence to adapt to a multicultural situation. Now this one may seem like the most obvious, right? It's like, well, yeah, I have to have some motivation, or maybe common sense. It's like, why not? Why wouldn't I wouldn't be in this profession if I didn't like to provide service to patrons. Or I wouldn't be pursuing this career if I didn't have some internal, interest. Well, it is the one that is most often overlooked. For example, sometimes we have to go through a required diversity training, but we might miss seeing its relevance to making myself more effective at my job. It might just be like, oh, I have to go through this training, but we don't really see, well, how is this applicable? How does it relate? Or maybe you need to travel overseas or go international or even domestically from one branch location to another branch location within, say, the same city. Well, we might not actually appreciate a training like that, learning about diversity and differences, until we actually get to that other location. And then maybe we're faced with some type of culture shock or other interactions. So it's actually very important to intentionally address the issue of drive. You can probably think of examples within the information profession. Maybe you are rolling out a new ILS, and there's an individual who's been working, with the task force or the group that's been working on rolling out this ILS, but they've seemed maybe distant, unmotivated, don't have time, don't feel interested at all. Maybe a seasoned worker, or maybe even a new employee. And so maybe there's been issues with the system, so even that motivation and morale is getting worse and worse. So you might want to approach that individual and find out, well, why is their level of drive low, or what's impacting them? Is it only the system? Is it maybe from the beginning they weren't heard or weren't listened to about their opinions and viewpoints? Or maybe there are others in the team working with them that haven't allowed maybe them to work on a particular part of the project, and they're doing something that is not their level of expertise. This is why it's critical if you're in management, to understand and know your staff and determining who to put on which project. And maybe there's something you need done and you know the right person, but do you really know that that person has that skill set? Just based on their background, possibly, but you might have to do some cultural intelligence assessment or cultural value assessment to find out if they would be a good fit in order to make sure it's a successful project. Now, there are subdimensions. These are the three subdimensions, and I alluded to them in the prior slide. Intrinsics or internal drive. So it's okay if you're not energized every time you come across, say, cross-cultural work or individuals daily that maybe you're not as energized. But we need to be in order to make sure we're providing the best service or the best resources. One strategy to develop your intrinsic interest is to connect an existing interest with an intercultural component. For example, if you like sports, explore sports in a different culture. Or the same thing can be applied to the arts. So it doesn't necessarily need to be, like, say, sports in Germany. If you're working with someone from that background, yes, you can explore that. But even locally, maybe you're not aware of or don't know a lot about your local sports team, yet the individual you're interacting with is very enthused, is very knowledgeable, goes to the games. We'll use that as a common ground to get to know them and understand their cultural values, their internal drive. Why are they interested in sports? What can you learn from that? Sports we can use across conflict and understanding conflict as well. Same thing with food. Food is another great way to, say, break the ice or to learn about a different culture. Extrinsic, is there any benefit? So what's in it for me? What's in it for them? What's the tangible benefit? Is there a promotion? Maybe a new opportunity within the organization, or maybe a future career adjustment? Can you put it on your resume? So what's that external interest? And then the self-efficacy, which is the confidence piece. Sometimes with intercultural training, it focuses too much on mistakes that people make, or we only hear those things that are negative. And that can erode our self-efficacy, even our drive as a whole. So this is a delicate balance between being a humble learner as well as not being paralyzed by the fear of doing something wrong. So for management, this is a perspective where you need to think about even how you provide feedback and criticism to your employees. Okay, so that's drive. Now knowledge is the second one, and knowledge is that cognition piece. So the level of understanding about how cultures are similar and different. Now there are so many cultures in the world. It'd probably be impossible, just given our brain capacity, to know and understand all cultures, right? But I challenge you to think about that one cultural group you're having a challenge with right now or have experienced a challenge with, and think about, well, what's similar or what's different? Can I do some research and learn about that group? And individuals that have high knowledge have a rich and well-organized understanding of cultures and how it affects the way people think and behave. So this also ties into our actions. So now we're going to watch a video by Derek Sivers, and he's going to talk about, is it weird or just different?
So imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in America, and a Japanese man comes up to you and says, excuse me, what is the name of this block? And you say, I'm sorry, well, this is Oak Street, that's Elm Street, this is 26th, that's 27th. He says, okay, but what is the name of that block? And you say, well, blocks don't have names. Streets have names. Blocks are just the unnamed spaces in between streets. He leaves a little confused and disappointed. So now imagine you're standing on a street anywhere in Japan. You turn to a person next to you and say, excuse me, what is the name of this street? And they say, oh, well, that's block 17 and this is block 16. And you say, okay, but what is the name of this street? And they say, well, streets don't have names. Blocks have names. Just look at Google Maps here. There's block 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19. All of these blocks have names, and the streets are just the unnamed spaces in between the blocks. And you say, okay, then how do you know your home address? I said, well, Easy. This is District 8. There's Block 17, house number 1. You say, okay, but walking around the neighborhood, I noticed that the house numbers don't go in order. He said, of course they do. They go in the order in which they were built. The first house ever built on a block is house number 1. The second house ever built is house number 2. Third is house number 3. It's easy. It's obvious. So I love that sometimes we need to go to the opposite side of the world to realize assumptions we didn't even know we had, and realize that the opposite of them may also be true. So for example, there are doctors in China who believe that it's their job to keep you healthy. So any month you are healthy, you pay them. And when you're sick, you don't have to pay them because they failed at their job. They get rich when you're healthy, not sick. In most music, we think of the 1 as the downbeat, the beginning of the musical phrase. 1, 2, 3, 4. But in West African music, the 1 is thought of as the end of the phrase, like the period at the end of a sentence. So you can hear it not just in the phrasing, but the way they count off their music. 2, 3, 4, 1. And this map is also accurate. There's a saying that whatever true thing you can say about India, the opposite is also true. So let's never forget, whether at TED or anywhere else, that whatever brilliant ideas you have or hear, that the opposite may also be true. Domo arigatou gozaimashita.
Okay, so while the slides are coming back up, I'd like to show that video because it shows, okay, is it weird or just different? Different, right? And his illustrations are going to the opposite side of the world. But we don't need to. We can go next door. Or if you're in a classroom, you can see the diversity in your classroom. Or if you have patrons coming from different audiences, you can see the diversity that we encounter. So we have to think that someone comes in and asks a particular question. Maybe we're uncomfortable, we're maybe fearful of this group, maybe afraid, we ask one of our colleagues to handle it. Well, we need to encounter that. We need to face that maybe bias we have and learn about that cultural group and think about, okay, so that was just a unique question. Maybe I never heard of it. I don't know the background of the individual. I don't know why. I didn't even, try to help answer the question for them or guide them to the resources and services we have. But I have to take it as this is not weird and this is not different. It's just unique. And we need to be inclusive in thinking about even a query we might receive. And so we don't necessarily need to go to the other part of the world or travel. We can see it in even our own organizations, whether it's with our staff or our patrons, etc. And you do have the link for that. It's in the notes for the TED Talk. So knowledge includes, businesses, cultural systems. Not everyone's logo is the same, mission statement, colors. Not every legal system is the same if you're looking at countries. So we have to be cognizant that even businesses, their processes, policy procedures may be different. And then the cultural values piece we talked about earlier, that's the interpersonal piece and what your value orientations are. But there's also, I want to show this slide and then talk about the sociolinguistics. Now, this is a real marketing campaign gone wrong. This was a print advertisement by Toyota. So Toyota ran this Prado ad in China, and they received extreme criticism for running the ad. So I'm going to ask you, why do you think it received such intense backlash? What's wrong with this advertisement? And you can just put it in the chat box, what ideas you might have. I will tell you while you're putting them in the chat that this is critical even for libraries. Clearly this is a huge corporation, but we all are marketing. We're marketing our services, we're marketing our programming, we're marketing our resources, we're marketing ourselves, we're marketing our library. That we need to be aware of our marketing tactics, our marketing visuals, our marketing language, particularly with the social media now and digitized marketing. That provides even another element because it may go worldwide, and you have to be careful with offending particular groups. Okay, so I'm going to start. Let me just see some of the responses we've received. Okay, I think you guys are on it. You guys have high CQ knowledge. So the first one, which is probably the one that's pointed out the most when I show this advertisement, are the lions. The lions are a powerful symbol in Chinese culture, and they're often seen outside banks and temples. And the Chinese perceived in this advertisement that one lion is bowing and one is saluting the Prado. So that was seen for a lion to be bowing to a Japanese car was seen as very offensive to the Chinese and saluting. Now, furthermore, the tagline at the top, does anybody have an idea what that says? It's in the upper left-hand corner. It says something to the effect of "you must respect." So here we can see a Japanese car maker is telling a Chinese culture that they must respect not only a vehicle, but also a Japanese vehicle. Now, there's one other big thing. Does anybody know that the bridge this vehicle is on? It's a very famous bridge. So this is a bridge just outside of Beijing, and it is the Marco Polo Bridge, and it is the Chinese bridge first that has the most lions on it, but second, it was the site of the Japanese invasion in 1937. So suddenly we can understand that just some basic history, some basic research about cultural systems, cultural symbols is a bottom line issue here. Toyota wasn't allowed to bring the Prado in for a long time, and they lost millions, probably if not billions of dollars as a result of this one advertisement. So, tying this to libraries, again, think about your marketing and what you're putting in print, what you're putting on social media, even the message verbally when you are, someone calls about a program. Are all staff on the same page as far as what they say about that program? So think about that with your marketing. And that ties to knowledge. Now, the sociolinguistics is the language piece. So understanding another language, your grasp of different languages, both verbal and nonverbal. And this largely relates to your ability to read and understand a language other than your own. But it could also be your same language, maybe in your culture. For example, Mexico, I'll use as an example. I travel a lot to Mexico, a lot of different regions. My husband's family comes from Mexico. But I can tell you, different regions, there's different dialects, different tones, even food is different, depending on where you might go in Mexico. So we can't assume just because someone comes from that background that they follow those same cultural values or norms or behaviors, or even eat the same food that we might assume, or if we want to put on a program, maybe for Mexican, Hispanic Heritage Month. Now consider just little things even. So when you're writing an email, or maybe typing up a memo on your computer, or typewriter if you still use typewriters, do you type the date as, say, February spelled out the number 2, 2018, or do you put 21, the number, and then spell out February? So even small things like the date, even how you address someone in communication. Is it Mr. or is it John? So just being aware of how to even address an individual has some cultural implications. And then do you use slang or abbreviations? Now it's hard with texting, tweeting, and all that with all the emojis. That even presents more challenge, but I would say an opportunity for us to learn, particularly as a generational, think about generational intelligence. If you have a program and maybe you're trying to target a particular generation and it's that younger generation and they're very comfortable and they know all that, we can learn from them and see, well, how can they help us in putting that program together and make sure it's really targeting that particular audience that we want to bring in for that program. And then leadership. Now, leadership is a whole lesson in itself, so I will just say one piece here about leadership, especially for those that are in leadership roles. or leading a team. So leadership, particularly here under knowledge, relates to how leadership needs to change for various cultural contexts. Now, it is often taught as universal, but it is not. And the quote actually here on the slide has a double meaning. So people often think they can trust their gut to spot a leader, but that is very dangerous. On the other hand, beauty and leadership are in the eye of the beholder. So it's important for you to know your staff and see and develop those that maybe aren't ready for a leadership opportunity, but to develop them into leaders. We all, I think, if we aren't already, or hopefully we'll have the opportunity to be a leader, whether it's leading a project or to be in a leadership role in another capacity, maybe even with an association. So we need to develop our diverse staff to make sure they have those opportunities. And one way to develop your understanding of different leadership preferences is to poll your team to see how much they want their leaders to even provide specific instructions. So this is looking at their leadership. So as my leader, maybe I need explicit instructions. Maybe I need direct communication. Or maybe I don't. But you'll have wide diversity across your staff. And then think, is there a cultural element here? Anytime you read a document, I do this all the time. You're reading a document, you're reading a paper, you're reading an email. Think, is there a cultural aspect? And how is it shaped by culture? And you could even hire a cultural coach or a broker to help you with your knowledge component. And then just do research. We have access to many resources, electronic and in print, so take some time to research the particular cultural group. Now the last two I'm going to tie together because really they do go hand in hand. The first one is strategy, and this one relates to your degree to which you are mindful, aware, and able to plan. If you have high strategy, you develop ways to use your cultural understanding to develop plans for new cultural interactions. So how many of us actually take the time to plan before an encounter? Probably if you know you have a meeting, you take time and you plan, you have everything together, or if you do a presentation, yes. But there are times where we can't plan every time a different patron comes in the door. But if we've done some research prior and you know who your patron groups are that you serve, maybe it's faculty, it's staff, particular diverse cultural groups within your 300-mile radius. Whatever it is, we can do research on those particular groups ahead of time to have at least a sense about some of the cultural values and maybe norms from their, you can look at generations, you can look at gender, you can look at ethnicity, all the cultural aspects for those groups. And then just being aware and mindful and checking. We need to make sure we make time to debrief. Do we check ourselves after a situation, after an encounter? Do we take time and maybe jot down observations? We need to slow down a little bit and take time to debrief and check in with ourselves, check in with our teams to make sure that we are assessing and saying, if I had this particular encounter again, what can make it better? What can make it more successful? Why did it fail this time? Is that patron going to come back and use our resources? Or are they going to go onto social media and spread a bad message that then millions hear through social media and it impacts our library? So think of the checking piece as very critical. Now here's a last exercise we're going to do. I want you to put in the chat window, describe what you see. And I want you to only put in the chat window, record those things that you can be sure of. So I'll give you a minute to type what you see. Remember, you're observing. I see a meeting is taking place, people sitting around a table. 5 people sitting at a table, some are looking at each other, someone's on a phone, someone's head's down. Okay, man at the head of the table, people thinking. Not engaged. Someone is holding a bag. Papers on the table. There's a woman. Okay, these are all really great interpretations. So if I asked you, we changed the question, I ask you, what are you interpreting? What do you see on the screen as far as an interpretation? All of these are interpretations. Your interpretation is what's going on here, what are the people doing, what's going on behind the scenes. We're coming up with our own story in our mind, right? But really the only observation here is, and if you can see color, there's black lines on a slide. It says picture 3, and then there's black lines. 5, we can say people. There's drawings of people, but we don't know the story behind it. We're interpreting what we think the story is. And this is also important when it comes to, we all have a story, our own story, as well as every patron you work with, your staff, everyone has their own story. So we need to make sure that we are observing, taking the time to observe and not interpreting what we think that story is. So spend some time reflecting on how you can improve your strategy, particularly with that cultural group you're having a challenge with. And take a minute to respond by checking your own assumptions, your own interpretations. And ask yourself, am I really observing or am I interpreting the situation? So don't judge, but notice. And then plan for maybe if you have that encounter or that situation again. Now the last one is action, and that really relates to the behavioral piece, because ultimately people will judge us based upon how we behave. So this is the degree which you might change your speech, your tone, your enthusiasm, your nonverbals, your verbal communication. But be careful not to change every time. There are particular situations where you might need to modify your reaction or your behavior, but make sure you're being authentic to your core, what your values are, and not compromising your own values for the particular situation every time. And so go back to your challenge, think about it, and make a commitment to yourself. Utilizing this model, what's one thing you will do or you will do differently to help with your challenge? So think about it, and I challenge you to go back to work. Next time you encounter that particular cultural group, utilize CQ. Try it and see if it helps with a particular situation. Now, lastly, these are next steps. You can do a cultural needs assessment. You can do that internally, and that's really getting to know your staff and talking with your staff, your management, your leadership, and determining what the needs are or if there are particular cultural groups you need to do research on. And then there's a cultural values profile, which looks like this. And this actually identifies those value orientations. Now there's 10, where you can learn and understand your own personal orientation on each of these dimensions. And that, again, is the first step to developing cultural intelligence. And then the other one is the cultural intelligence assessment. And this one is much more detailed. It does include the value orientations, and it helps you identify your strengths and developmental opportunities to function effectively in these situations, and provides a development feedback report with actions or next steps for each of them, depending on what your levels are. So with that, remember, it's important to understand and incorporate, and I think as our profession continually changes, and going beyond that awareness can help us improve with our interactions. So make sure you're using your cultural intelligence. And now I'm going to turn it over for any questions. So Brianna?
Okay, so thank you so much. So yeah, if anyone has any questions, you can feel free to start putting them in the chat box for everyone to see. And then we'll spend the last like 5 or 6 minutes here going over them. So we'll give people a few moments and you can send them in.
And as a reminder, in the notes section, the handouts and bibliography are in the Google Drive link. So you'll get an example of the 2 sample reports I just showed and a full bibliography of resources for you.
Okay, so I do see a few people typing.
Okay.
Give them a few minutes.
Can I just read it, Brianna, and address it? I see one.
Yeah, so we'll just start going through. So Linda, I hope I'm pronouncing this right, Carul. For someone new to CQ, is there a book that you'd recommend as a starting point?
Oh, there are many. I think probably, and I own them all, but I would say probably a good starting point would be the first one I would start with, because remember, cultural values are the starting point before really getting into cultural intelligence. There is a book, it's by David Livermore. It's called Expand Your Borders, Discover 10 Cultural Clusters. It's a very small book, about $12, and I think that's a great starting point that leads into cultural intelligence. So I would start there in learning about the cultural clusters and those cultural value orientations. And then you can move into looking at others on that resource list that talk about cultural intelligence. Because there's one for leadership. I mean, there's many depending on what aspect you want to apply it to. But great question.
Okay, and let's see. Kathy asked, is there overlap between cultural intelligence and emotional intelligence? She is more familiar with the latter.
There is, and on my resource list, I've included some journal articles, and there's actually dissertations that have been written on the topic too. And I think the biggest overlap relates to the empathy specifically and the drive. So more the beginning pieces of cultural intelligence, where your motivation and how empathetic are you, but also at the end in your action. And if you're displaying and using those behaviors. So if you need more info, check the bibliography, but you can also email me and I can direct you to additional resources. But there is overlap. It's like the next level after emotional intelligence.
Okay, and Mandy Goodset asks, how do you balance trying to respect someone's perceived culture and stereotyping them?
So this is one that I think is always a challenge because we have our own unconscious biases, right? So I would suggest starting with yourself. Even with cultural intelligence is about starting with yourself and your own awareness and where you're at. So understanding your own biases and maybe trying to overcome them so that if you encounter them again, you won't use those biases. And it's really hard, especially for the ones that are unconscious. However, practice, practice, practice. And then learning and reading about those particular cultures. So if you have, and that's why I like this little book I mentioned, the Expand Your Borders. There might be one where, they have, like it's, I don't know, Latin Europe culture. And so we can't assume that all Latin Americans are high in being flexible and adaptable, maybe with instructions. So that's where we have to take time to actually get to know the individual too. We can learn about, in generalization or overall, but be careful not to pinpoint and then you're stereotyping where you could be wrong. So I would say practice and based on research. And especially if you're working with that group, a particular cultural group, you can do a lot of research. And if you're able to interact with them and even observe, I think observations help a lot. And then you can check yourself and say, am I interpreting this? Am I assuming? Am I now stereotyping them where I am completely wrong? And then you can interact with them and see if, commonalities, sports, food, arts, things where you might have some commonalities to learn about each other, even though you have differences. Hopefully that helps, but email me otherwise.
All right, and then we want to be respectful of people's time, and we're getting towards the end. So I think we'll end with one last question. So Natasha McFarland asks, do you have recommendations as to how we use these tools, I think, within the organization?
I have many. Email me. Email me because I can give you a list of things you can do internally. And given that this webinar was, full scope, I would say both. I tried to relate it to internal and also working with patrons. Email me and I'll give you some suggestions, especially working with inside an organization. And if you're thinking, I don't know if you're from a management level, because that's different than if you're at a staff level and maybe trying to impact your team or to work up the ladder towards management or to get management to make some changes. so I can give you some ideas based on your situation.
Okay, so it's 2 o'clock now. We want to be respectful of people's time. And I just want to say thank you to you, Dr. Villagan, for presenting the webinar, and thank you to everyone who participated. And like we said, we will be sending out a recording along with the links to the handout and the bibliography, and also posting that. That'll be available on ALA's e-learning site as well.
Thank you very much. I hope everyone has a great day. And remember, CQ, cultural intelligence.
All right, thanks everyone.